Welcome to another episode of Breaking into Cybersecurity. Today we have Jason Casey, who is sharing his journey of breaking into cybersecurity. Jason, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and what got you into tech and cybersecurity?
Sure. First, thanks for having me on the show. It's been a bit of a circuitous journey. I started way back when as a software engineer working on network protocols and network infrastructure. That led me to an area of networking like traffic monitoring, traffic capture, pattern analysis over that capture, that sort of thing, which brought me to big data intelligence forensics. And then from there, you're staring at a lot of indicators of compromise, indicators of like certain types of attack sequences carrying out. When you take a step back and look at the patterns that emerge, there was an interesting aha moment around like 80% of these things are all focused on one area in kind of IT architecture that could be changed. And that's when I kind of made the jump from intelligence and reconnaissance to defense. And that was in 2019. But I would say I've kind of always been in infrastructure and security infrastructure all the way back to 2000.
Let's take a little bit deeper dive. As you progressed from your earlier career and kind of progressed along, was your intention to grow and stay in infrastructure, or did cybersecurity kind of just pop along and become an area of interest and then got you sucked in?
I would say my first priority has always just been like, or not first priority, but like my prime motivator has always just been kind of curiosity, right? So interesting problems. I've always been drawn to system style problems. So for instance, in high school, I played a lot of games, right? Like, I don't know if you remember Falcon 3.0 or Falcon 4.0 flight simulators, and they had an ability to network. You could connect it to, you can call your friend's house on the phone line and engage with each other in kind of one-to-one dogfight. And then Command and Conquer and Red Alert came along and you could do similar things, but like in a different style of game. And I was fascinated with, I mean, I had already been programming because programming was fun. It was a way to solve problems, but I was fascinated with the communication side of programming. Like, how do I get my program to talk to another program, especially if it's running on a computer I don't control? And that pulling that thread, I think, is what got me into systems engineering and network protocols, which got me, my first, I would say, systems job at a startup in Austin called Point One Telecommunications. And then the problem that became really interesting there, that company was essentially building out voice networks across the US, but voice over IP based networks. So voice communications used to be circuit based, and circuit networks are very different than packet networks, and they're very expensive to build. And so at the time, it was the moment where the entire world was going to convert from circuit networks to packet networks. And so we were trying to surf that particular wave. But when we built out, and we weren't the only ones, everybody kind of built out their networks in a similar way. We built it out on a private addressing scheme. And then all of a sudden you realize, all right, I want to peer my network with another global operator. And it's really kind of crazy that I have to dump my traffic out through a IP to circuit gateway, then through their circuit to IP gateway to then travel across their network. It felt stupid, wasteful, not elegant, all sorts of things. But you couldn't just join the interior of your networks either for reasons, for the most practical reason of they're on a private address space, I'm on a private address space, right? So I need some kind of double NAT solution. And then you pull that thread and you realize, well, wait a minute, this voice over IP protocol creates something called a layer violation. It makes, it's an application layer protocol, but it makes assumptions about the audio and video streams and the IPs and the ports they're going to use. So the minute that traffic crosses a firewall or NAT, it breaks itself essentially. This problem became really interesting, right? Like, how do you peer these two networks? How do you solve the practical problems of addressing, but how do you solve the security problems, right? Like, these resources on these voice over IP networks were kind of like the cash registers of these businesses. And whether it was simple attacks like denial of service, distributed denial of service for the lulls, or more sophisticated attacks, this was all happening way back then as well. So you needed not just this NAT fix up solution, you also needed a firewall fix up solution. And then, you pull that thread, and that kind of brought me to a company called NetRate. which for better or worse, you could think of it as like a carrier grade firewall that was protocol aware, like it understood voice over IP and it could then kind of do the fix up at the edge. But all of a sudden you're like, all right, well, I'm carrying 40 to 50,000 simultaneous calls through each of these boxes. For quality monitoring, sometimes I need to be able to tap and trace and monitor. And then from CALIA, at least in North America's perspective, I need to be able to tap and trace for law enforcement. And so, you keep pulling that thread and you get to a set of interesting problems, and the use cases ultimately end up really being a combination of security and enablement, right? How do I enable these businesses to connect to each other? But how do I do it in a way that doesn't jeopardize their revenue? So honestly, I think you can think of most of my career as kind of that. That's kind of how I have always earned a living, earned an income. But the aspect has changed quite a bit, right? So in the early days, it was kind of routing and firewall security. And then it moved into um, big data intelligence. So just to give a little bit more color to what that means, at a company called IronNet, we basically plugged into a customer's data center and captured and analyzed all of their east-west traffic. So you can think of north-south traffic as traffic that kind of enters the data center, leaves the data center. East-west traffic is traffic that just stays within the data center. And east-west is historically, it wasn't really monitored that well. And so lateral movement by an adversary was difficult to detect because it wasn't even being thoroughly monitored. Now, when you really dig into that problem, it's like, all right, well, these links, these are 40 gig links. So I'm monitoring for how many 40 gig links am I monitoring? How do I do that? How do I keep up? How do I do it with any level of efficacy? And then every now and then you find something too, right? Like, oh shit, this is a TTP that seems to be used by an Iranian threat actor. It's definitely fun, but I would say for me, the prime motivator has always just been curiosity. Like, how do these things work? I would say I'm also proud of the fact that the result of this work is really, really meaningful to people, right? Like whether it's Beyond Identity today or a lot of my previous companies, our mission, our reason to exist is to protect the livelihoods of our customers, right? Like when we work, they stay up. And that's a part of the motivation as well. Like I've always had issue just trying to, I'd say half of what's hot at any moment in time in the startup ecosystem has never been that appealing to me just because it doesn't have that second part of the mission. It needs to be technically challenging, but it also
Mhm.
needs to contribute in some way.
So your career has really evolved to really different areas of the technical spectrum over the years. What advice would you give for folks for them to be able to tackle that challenge from an educational perspective so that they could keep their career alive and going and to be able to tackle that sort of challenge?
I would say two things. One is feed your curiosity, right? Like learning is fun and treating it, don't treat it as a chore. Try and figure out what you're actually interested in and just keep investing in that. But the second thing is fundamentals always work. There's a saying that I heard it in the late 90s when I was in college, and it still seems to be a statement people like to say today, which is, hey, this industry changes so fast. You're going to learn something today and it's going to be thrown out the window tomorrow. The fundamentals of computer engineering, the fundamentals of computer science, the fundamentals of distributed systems. We apply those fundamentals in new systems, right? Kubernetes is new. Docker is quasi new. Building out a multi-agent architecture to work on your behalf or in your product is new. But if you peel the veneer off the side, it is about fundamentals. When you like, let's read about any of the security issues coming out of the AI world, prompt injection, data exposure, data leakage, and whatnot. These aren't new ideas. And when you dig into the cause of them, they're also not new principles. We've known for a long time that control and data separation is a key property of systems that you can reason over and secure. And when you look at how an agent works, it mixes instruction and data in the context window. It mixes instruction and data in its stream. So from a principles and fundamentals perspective, you can look at that and understand where these vulnerabilities come from and how their exploitations work. And you can also have a leg up on the person who doesn't understand the fundamentals of like, what's a principled way of solving this problem where I'm not going to be back tomorrow whacking the mole again. And tactically speaking, it has to do with separation of control and data and leaning into the agent architecture to do that. But then there's also a research angle there, right? Should the training of models not just focus on data, but also on instruction with some level of carve out or separation concerned? If we zoom back up to a super high level, principles matter. And they've certainly been what's helped me transition across the domains in my career, because regardless of all the change that's happened, the principles and the fundamentals have not changed. Distributed systems still work in the same way. And if you don't believe what I'm saying, I would challenge you to go read or reread Cuckoo's Egg, right? Written in the early 80s. Was it Clifford Stoll was the author? PhD academic out of Berkeley, and basically chasing the Russians around the DoD infrastructure in the university environment. In that book, he invents an intrusion prevention system. He invents the concept of decoys or deception. He invents the concept of a firewall. He invents the concept of monitoring and monitoring analysis. And, we still use all of these concepts today in modern security. Clearly, they're more sophisticated than what he did. But like, my challenge is, if you think things have drastically changed, go read that book. You're going to see a lot of things that look familiar.
Yeah, and as you grew in your career, how have you helped others, for example, in the organizations that you've worked with, develop career paths for those under you to help them grow in a principled way so that they can have that growth path within the organization as a leader?
I think it has to do, so a couple things. So first I would say one of the things I'm most proud of was this organization called Programmable. It's a nonprofit I created when I was in grad school. And it kind of came out of a couple facets. I went back to grad school as a 30-year-old. I'd been working for 10 years. I was looking to scratch a particular itch. A year into grad school, I also realized that pure academia wasn't really for me. Like, my trick was, how do I take techniques in academia that aren't really used in industry and apply them in new and interesting ways to kind of have a leg up? And so we were created a little research team of folks that had some of those practical interests like I did, like building real things that people could use. And it happened to be in the world of software defined networking. It started to become successful in that we got a lot of attention, and people started sending us money to fund or to influence and steer the direction of some of our work, right? Like, hey, would you improve this documentation and this open source reference implementation that you built? Would you keep pushing it this direction? Could you try and answer this research problem? And so we thought, oh, we don't know how to do anything with this. And so, yeah, we created this nonprofit to kind of receive that and manage that, and then kind of help offset the cost of education and whatnot for the folks participating in Programmable. The reason why I say that's one of my proudest things is almost all of the folks involved with Programmable are still with me today, either working directly at Beyond Identity, or they're working in kind of my friend slash ecosystem. Like, we got them all really good jobs. And beyond just getting them good jobs, they're contributing at a high level, name brand companies, frontline problems for them. So that was kind of a proud thing for me. But the question of how do you groom the principles and the fundamentals, for me, it's been a combination of trying to select more senior folks around who I can embed in the team that already have that, but then also just forcing it. So when we build projects, we start with a design. A design has a domain model. A domain model is what the user of a system would experience. A data model is going to be that plus a little bit more when you're building out systems. But a domain model is so important because it teaches you how your users interact with the system. It's kind of the mental model your users have to understand to interact with your system. Modifying that domain model is a state transition, right? Every state transition should produce an event. Otherwise, you don't have complete observability. Every state transition has the potential to have a hook, right? Hooks are how you actually build in extension over time. And what I've just described is probably 6 lines of just principles in building that just make you have a more robust yet simple architecture, right? So putting those things in place and then making sure that the team is actually using them and leveraging them and seeing kind of the insights and the things that they bring. And then, there is no real progress without putting people in the fire. Steel's hardened in the furnace. People are too. And so that also means giving them projects that matter and giving them projects where like they don't know how they're actually going to get to the end in the beginning, and getting them to the point where they build confidence to understand that they don't have to have all the answers. They just have to have the belief that they'll get to the right answer. It's kind of a bag of things.
So earlier you mentioned the use of AI, and today AI can be used for a lot of things, and some people use AI as a tool to enable them. Others use AI or become a tool of AI. What are your thoughts in using AI in the world of programming? For example, using Claude and developing programming models and vibe coding and things like that.
So my thoughts are changing. So I've always loved these tools, but how I interact with these tools has certainly changed. I predominantly used OpenAI and ChatGPT models for the first 2 or 3 years of my experimentation. Most of that usage was educational. Hey, I want to learn a topic. Hey, I think this is right. Is this right? Is it wrong? Tell me why. And I loved it. I felt like it sped up my learning journey without actually having to have an expert physically be near me. I did experiment with using it to generate code, systems code, programs, as well as like shell scripts, that sort of thing. My experience was varied. In the beginning, it would produce things that simple things would work, complex things would not. In the end, complex things would work. But man, the path the agent found to go from A to Z was wild, right? Like you could demonstrate the concept, but you do not want to put that in production because then you have to maintain it. And holy hell, how are you going to maintain that? I've changed my thought on that. And I've also changed my tooling. The latest renditions of Claude code are mind blowing, at least to me, in terms of practical engineering work. Just over the last 2 weeks, I figured out, and maybe I'm an idiot and everyone else already knows this and I'm just late to the game, but Claude code is very good. Rather than being wrapped in an app, it installs in your terminal. So you can almost think of it as a metaphor of like, I'm going to have a disk, a virtual disk. I'm going to mount that disk with this agent, and it's going to have access to everything inside of that disk. And so I don't have to copy and paste things around. It just knows. And, there's the equivalent of an ACL list that you build up off the side of what you want to allow it to do and not do, right? Read, modify on this virtual disk. So I realized it has this concept called memory. And so memory is basically a file. There's like three levels: system, user, and project. And it has a precedence, but the precedence is kind of the opposite of what you would expect. Most applications, system is general, user is more specific, and then project is most specific, right? So the overrides kind of go in that order for classic Unix utility configuration files. Claude's a little different. It's the opposite, right? So your project is the most general, your user will override, and your system will override. But what it is it's a set of prompts that when you actually load Claude code, it will load these memory files as a set of conditioning the context window, if you will, right? When you normally interact with an AI agent, you start up the agent, the context window. If it's a new conversation, the context window is empty. It doesn't really know that much about you. And it kind of learns through the interaction. With these memory files, you can load in your preferences. I started working back and forth and building out these preferences. And then I realized, wait a minute, this is kind of like a classic programming project anyway. So I created this project called Meta because it's like metacognitive. And the goal of Meta is to build a memory file. And it has all of this source, and it has make install and clean. And some of them are kind of classically driven, right? Scripts that just go in and delete certain things. But some of them are driven by agents where it takes all this, my personal preferences. It takes like engineering principles. It takes communication style, and it composes these into essentially a Claude optimized prompt that can then be copied to the right location so that when I start Claude, it will act as the system expert. Anyway, long story short, I then use this to then go build a couple of projects, like real engineering projects. And remember my earlier example of like, the tools have gotten good enough to where they'll make something that works. It'll connect the dots from A to Z, but like when you peek under the hood, holy hell, I don't want to deploy that because I'll have to maintain it. Well, what Claude does, or what it seems to do with my earlier tests with memory, is it filters the journey. And so it lets you actually control how it gets from A to Z. So for instance, my programming style is I would say I was greatly influenced by Unix utility philosophy, which is tools should do one job and not much more than that. All tools should return proper exit codes and use standard in and standard out and standard error. So you can kind of chain, right? Because that's the Unix way, is to take a bunch of simple tools and pipeline for complex behavior. And that translates to my programming style as well. Like functions shouldn't really have more than 10 lines. And the reason for that is it's always easy to reason over 10 lines. It's always easy to understand what's going on in 10 lines. You can't do a lot with 10 lines, kind of that Unix philosophy kind of coming down into code, and then compose functions and let functions be pure most of the time, right? It's a little bit of functional programming. And there's some other stuff there around, like it gets more complicated, like prefer RCU and lockless data structures and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we started building some tools and all of these preferences were expressed through these kind of expert hierarchical prompts. And the code that it built was good. Like you could pick any spot in the code and understand what was going on. And this was kind of the aha moment for me in that tooling has really changed. I was running a couple of tests at the same time. Two of them were building out coding projects. One of them was general cloud service type stuff, but one of them was more specific, leveraging local hardware to do hardware specific things. Both of those projects worked really well. And then I had a project that wasn't really a code project. It was threat intelligence research. And so this is the other thing, right? Like Claude Code, most people think of it as using it to write code. But remember, these models have been trained over not just code, but communication patterns, email, marketing data, sales data, threat intelligence data. And over the course of a week, using a similar set of techniques as I just described on the coding project, right? Defining that filter so that when we go from A to Z, like the internal contents are explainable and reviewable and that sort of thing. We built out this amazing documentation on, so Beyond Identity, we're identity focused security company, right?
Yeah.
Our argument is 80% of the incidents that most companies chase are identity failures. So like, let's look at them. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted a good documentation project on systematically mapping out every authentication technique and factor that
Mhm.
exists, right? And then breaking it down to what are the atomic tactics that work on each phase of these authentication techniques. And
Mm.
then after that, enumerating sequences, right? Attack sequence.
Mhm.
Like, how do I combine those atoms to go after this, to go after this, to go after this? And so again, systematic enumeration.
Mm.
And then at the end, I wanted to reference which of these are theoretical, like demonstratable in a lab by a red team, but not documented in the wild versus documented in the wild. And then kind of from there, flip the script and then build up threat actor inventories, right? And then do a change over time analysis. And then at the end, of course, you want to turn this all into detections, right? Because you're an identity company. You want to make sure your customers know when sketchy things are happening. And so there's attack detection and then there's post-compromise detection. And based on this previous input, the prompt was, all right, now I want you to using these atoms and using these attack sequences, and then knowing that an identity model is always, the domain model is identity, credential, the edges are enroll, use, delete. There are different factor strengths. There are different classes, right? So like you have this partial order between passwords, right? Credentials versus
Mhm.
like crypto keys.
Mhm.
And it built out this sequence. And granted, I was going back and forth with it for like a week, but this turned into a 50-page report. It was credible enough to actually pass muster with experts. Things have really changed in the last couple of months. And if you're reading the news, you see the Anthropic actually call it what they think is a Chinese threat actor actually using Claude to automate actual attacks in the wild. So yeah, the
Yeah.
adversary AI, we're using AI. You can use it to defend yourself. You can use it to work faster, and you can use it in a way to kind of help your customers engage with you better or go faster. And really, most companies probably ought to be doing all of the three.
It sounds like you have to know the principles, know what you want to achieve from the process, and know the outcome that you're looking for in order to use it to enable yourself, not
It's
just use it like a magical black box and hope that you get the answer on the other end.
Yeah, think about that A to Z, right? So one of it looks like spaghetti and one of it is a straight line. You're never going to use anything that's not the straight line, but to get that straight line, you need that domain expert filter, right? And that's the role you play. So yeah, AI is not, there's like the big AI boogeyman, right? It's coming for all of us. And then there's the little AI. And then like, this is a really powerful tool that enables us, the domain experts, to do things better and faster. And, that's how I'm trying to encourage folks to interact with it.
Yeah, definitely agree. Well, with the last couple of minutes, what other advice would you give to individuals potentially looking to follow in your footsteps and to keep up with a cybersecurity career today?
Feed your curiosity, experiment. Whiteboards are great to communicate, but if you don't fly the project for real, you don't really understand it. It doesn't hit brain. If you're not breaking things, you're not really understanding the boundaries. My biggest advice is just do. The only barrier to starting is you starting. Tools like Claude and OpenAI and whatnot, it'll help you learn faster. It'll help you experiment faster, embrace them and figure it out. One simple kind of hack on getting better usage out of these tools is every now and then have a meta conversation with it. Hey, Claude, analyze our previous conversations and tell me how to prompt you better, or act as a prompt expert and give me advice on how to improve my interaction with you to shorten the time.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your advice, Jason, and thank you for joining us on the show today. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.